New Type is a fast and reliable source of Gunpla supplies in the US. For my fellow Canadians, Argama Hobby offers the largest stock of kits, tools, and paints. Let's unbox the HG Psycho Gundam Mk-II and look for faster and easier ways to sand our Gunpla parts while still getting clean results. Even a 10% faster process across so many pieces can make a huge difference. Let's go. Let's unbox my order from Argama Hobby, my amazing sponsors where I get my kits, tools, and paints. There are 3 kits in here. One of them is kind of for a future video idea, so if I see it, I'm gonna pull them out. I heard the kit is really big, but yeah, we'll see. Is this it? Oh my god, this looks like the bottom of the kit. Oh my goodness. This is humongous. Oh my gosh, I have to show Cookie after. What the heck? Purple is my favorite color, and we don't get enough purple Gunpla. Thank you so much, Argama Hobby, for your support. I know.
Wow! What is this? Wow, it looks like me, right?
What?
Can I open up? Wow! This proportion and the transfer the airport. This is the main razor. Okay?
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank
okay,
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. There's a lot more detail here than I thought there would be. And I see a lot of potential for parts separation here. Really like the colors. Ooh, what are these long fingernails? Looks like when a girl comes out of the nail shop. It's really cool when you see all the Zeta kits actually put together. First thing I notice is there's nothing about decals. I guess there just aren't any decals at all, which is kind of crazy. I am going to order water slide decals. Arthur from Argama Hobby has let me know that when they come in for grout work, he's gonna let me know. And if I can't get it in time, I'm just gonna order from Delpy Decal, but I don't have a great experience ordering from Delpy Decal just because they use FedEx. Last time I bought decals, it cost me like $30 for my products and I paid like $16 in import and handling fees, which is ridiculous. But if I'm desperate, I will order it for this and probably the MG Vidar. I just noticed this is so cool, like the damaged head. I love this kind of stuff. All right, let's get going. Surprisingly, there aren't too many junk parts, and I've circled and written the runner numbers here so it's a little easier for me to find. These are all the junk parts. I usually keep all junk parts no matter what kit they're from in just like one junk bag. I used to have a whole bunch of them, but I threw them away when we moved from Korea. I did notice some of the junks were V-fins, which I'm gonna keep with me outside of the general junk bag just because, I don't know, in case they break or whatever. I don't scratch build, but I do test paint a lot, and it's nice to have real parts to test on instead of spoons. Usually I like to cut out the runner letter to help me keep my parts organized because I'm just a little lazy to make separate labels, but also I like seeing the color of the runner. So sometimes when a part goes out of place, I kind of usually know where to put it. But at the same time, I find that sometimes I want to go back to the runner just to check something and I don't know what letter it's from anymore. So I'm just gonna write it in. I'll actually just do that for all of them. Look at this teeny tiny part amongst all of the huge pieces. I won't be touching this until it's time to paint. There was a time when I was trying to get to know more about the Gundam universe and went on a Gundam anime watching spree. To be honest, I found most of the older animes pretty boring, probably controversial opinion, but at the end of it all, I found my favorite female character to be 4. Just everything about her, from her 80s fashion, hairstyle, and backstory, that just really resonated with me, and I don't know, my heart just really went out to her. She's also the only anime figure I own. Cookie says he thinks I'm more like Haman Khan though, which is just him really throwing a punch at me, but mind you, she's my second favorite character. But anyway, it had been a really long time since I watched these anime, and I'm also really bad with remembering names and details. So for the longest time after that, I thought 4 was the pilot of the Psycho Gundam Mk-II. I just got them mixed up and the colors just really match up. I was really disappointed when I relearned that she didn't pilot this kit. But anyways, my point is I'm still really quite a fan of both the Psycho Gundams. Because I'm quite a fan of this kit, I plan to paint it in its original colors. It's going to be a casual build and paint job, so I'm hoping to find ways to do the prep work before painting as fast as possible. Also, sanding is the one thing about making Gunpla that I mostly just really hate doing, so I'm always trying to make small tweaks or find ways to make it easier or faster, especially with a casual build like this. I actually found the sanding to be a lot less painful this time around, so I'm going to share how I made my sanding process a bit faster and easier. Remember, I'm not saying this is the only way or that everyone should do it like this, but I'm just sharing my own process. I'd like to point out that to make the first cut of the parts off the runners, I'm using a Tamiya nipper. I've had this nipper for 10 years. I cut resin nubs with it, and it's never chipped and is still going strong. It's really good for rough cuts. For the second cut, when you clip the gate off the part, I really recommend investing in a good quality pair of nippers. Having a clean final cut will save you the time it takes to do cleanup work with an art knife. I use the Godhand nippers in this video, but also own a Dispier and find that to be just as good, but at a slightly lower cost. Remember, these nippers tend to be more fragile, and I've actually broken 2 Godhand nippers before, so I recommend you only use them for plastic gate removal. This is how things are looking now. Remember, I do try to put them so that the colors don't get confused. Instead of putting purple and purple side by side, I have a different color in the middle. These ones have kind of really small pieces, so I put them in a little tray. And we've got one more here. I just finished cutting up the hand. These are all of the empty runners, which I will keep until the very end. And I do have a bunch of clear parts here. I'm not going to handle them because I'm really tired of clipping, but also they don't need to be sanded. I can just clip these up when I get to top coating. Do now is clip off the extra gates and then get to sanding. Here I am cutting the nubs off the part level by level. This helps to prevent stress marks if you are just straight building, but also prevents damaging the plastic if you are painting. This is just one cut. However, for a casual build, I only cut by level for very big nubs and do one quick cut for smaller nubs. A nub mark like this, I would probably use an art knife to shave it down a little bit. So just a quick thing I noticed on this kit is because the parts are so big, I can see the injection streaks really clearly. And this is when the plastic meets during injection when it's in the mold. If you were going for like an A grade kit. A lot of Korean modelers, they would teach you to sand the entire surface of the part so you can get rid of this. I did that for my black sazabi because I was aiming for like a really high finish, but for this kit I'm not going to do that. And to be absolutely honest, you're really not going to see it after you paint. So let's compare it after painting. I also noticed there's a lot of scratches on my kit. I think it's just because I was filming the transition shots with all the runners bunched up together. So I don't think I'm going to film that type of shot in the future because it scratched a lot of my parts, which I knew could be the case, but I just thought it wouldn't really be a huge deal. I will get rid a bit of these scratches. I think cutting parts off the runner and clipping gates off the parts is something you can really develop a feel and your own process for. So I didn't go into it too much in this video. There are little things that I do, but as you make the cuts, you'll notice for yourself what gives you the cleanest cuts, how to cut without leaving marks, and if the marks you did leave behind are even noticeable after painting, decal, and top coat. Wow, is it all done? Thank you. What happened to your hair? Okay, so let's get on to sanding here because I've decided that this is going to be a pretty casual build. I'm not going to go full out with sanding. I've been using the 400 and 600 sanding sticks and respectively the sponges as well. Sometimes if I feel like I've pushed a little too hard or if I want that part to be a little bit smoother, I will use a 1000 sanding sponge, but I'll also show you how else I use this. I've got a wet wipe here. I did already pour a bit of water because it does dry out. This is actually not really to help me catch the dust, more as it is for me to brush off the dust from my brush and the part. I'm starting with a pretty old 400 stick because it's pretty old. It's not gonna be as harsh on this part. If you used a new 400, it's going to be a little harsher. Technically, you could just sand with the 400. One of the ways that I've made sanding easier for myself is I try to do only long strokes, okay? So I sand like this. And I do kind of try to get different angles if I feel like I'm not getting the nub mark. You'll also notice that I haven't sanded the nub mark down all the way. I leave about like say 20% of it because I'm gonna go in with a 600 here, and this is about how much I would do. Now, if you do want to get really smooth with it, you could go in with 1000. I wouldn't say you have to, but the reason why I do for some parts is you'll notice after sanding, there is a bit of this residue here, this white line here, which you could scratch off with your fingers, but I find that is kind of a lot of work. I find that if I kind of angle this a bit just to catch that residue, I don't necessarily have to use my fingernails, and I can also kind of smooth this out as well. On this part, I used the 1000 and it's a bit smoother. And on this part, I didn't use the 1000 and it's a bit rougher. In my experience, this is gonna show up a bit under primer, but by the time you get to the top coat, you're probably not gonna notice it. So it really depends on how much this bothers you. Sometimes I sand it off, sometimes I don't. It depends on how scratchy the part looks, how big it is. So for a part that's this big where I think it's going to be noticeable, I probably would go in with the 1000 for just a bit, but for really small parts I might not necessarily use that 1000. I turn the part around to make it as easy for my sanding stick to slide naturally and smoothly as possible. I started sanding this part off a bit, but I notice it's not really catching this really big nub very well. As I'm sanding, it's getting the rest of the parts, but there's this nub spot here that I really want to make sure I get. Not only can I change the angle, but I often use my thumb to place it in a way where the sanding stick will stay in position to catch the nub better. So I would sand it like this. So you see it's already come off a lot better. Then go in with my 600. And I do sand at different angles. Different people have different thoughts about that. I remember one of my old Gunpla teachers said to never sand at different angles. I kind of disagree with that because I feel like just naturally you just push the sanding stick a little bit more one way or the other. So I do sand at different angles sometimes if the nub is a little bit more stubborn, thick, or harder to get at. For any dust or residue, I use my brush and I wipe it a bit on my wet wipe just because there's already quite a lot of dust on it and the static just moves the dust around more than actually wiping it off. And then I just, get the dust off. This is actually an old makeup brush. Oh, and I forgot a nub here. So here's a pretty big nub that is a little bit more annoying to get because there's these things on the side here. If you have these kind of sponges, this might be a little bit easier. But if not, you could still use a stick here. But you'll see that it's not necessarily even and it's not really even getting the nub, in which case you could do this as well. The sponge will kind of be able to help you concentrate on that part a lot more. And again, I don't sand it all the way perfectly down to 100% because whatever sanding grit you're gonna go in next with is gonna help you do that. And that's gonna help you save a little bit more energy as well. Because this is a pretty big part, I'm gonna use my 1000 here. This is just for my own mental satisfaction, knowing it's going to be as smooth as possible. Whatever scratches you see, honestly, after I've used my 1000 on it, it's not going to show up after painting. Okay. And if you don't paint and you want to just straight build, I would use like the finer grits to kind of really smooth this out. I actually used to kind of sand the whole part so at least it looks a little bit more the same. And not like some parts are kind of glossy and some parts are not. This does get rid of a lot of the scratches. Like I really dislike this gloss and matte differentiation after sanding on bare plastic. You could sand this down as much as makes you feel comfortable. This is probably what I would do if I were straight building. I also wouldn't push as hard with the 400 if I were straight building, or maybe just even use a 600 so that you don't get too much of these white scratches, because right now the surface is actually totally smooth but there's still these scratch marks. You can compare two parts where I use the 1000 and I didn't use the 1000. Overall, I found my sanding process to be a lot easier and less horrible and painful than usual. To be absolutely honest, I think the biggest reason is just because this is such a huge kit without an inner frame. That means there are fewer small parts and bigger pieces are easier to work with and sand. This is one of the reasons why I don't normally paint RG kits. The tiny parts are really hard to work with, especially if you plan to paint. Even though I always recommend starting out with smaller kits as a beginner, sometimes I see comments saying, oh, I'll start with an RG kit, and I actually don't really recommend that. Another thing I really want to recommend is to experiment with different grits and how they look after surfacer, paint, and a top coat. Can you see the scratches from a 400 grit after surfacer? Maybe. Can you still see it after paint, decal, and matte top coat? Doing these experiments can help you save time from unnecessarily sanding with higher grits and find a sweet spot for yourself. Let's take a look at how I prep and test paint on spoons to make sure there are no bubbles and flaking. I'll also share how I personally mix and choose colors for my Gunpla in this HG Psycho Gundam Mk-II build and paint vlog. Let's start off by mixing the main colors for this kit, and then I'll talk all about plans and stuff like that later. Here are my paints. I might not be using all of them, but some of them are new purchases, these two, and I just want to see how they look like out of bottle. Are my good old labels. Bottles, these I bought off of Amazon. You can check them out on my Amazon storefront. There's really pros and cons to bottles like this. The cap is a part of the lid, which means you'll never lose the cap, but also it dribbles out in a kind of weird way. But I did buy these just because they were the cheapest and came in the largest amount that I could find in Canada. But the really important thing about these bottles is finding bottles that are a hard plastic. A lot of bottles that look like this, they actually come in the soft, flimsy plastic, and you don't want to use that for lacquer paint. I will be mixing my Odankan paints with the Odankan thinner and anything else with the Gaia Brushmaster. I used these spoons, which I bought from Dollarama in Canada. After I test paint with spoons, I keep them in a little container. I write the paint, or if it's mixed, the ratio. Normally you would think like painting on spoons is really easy, but I guess nothing in painting Gunpla is necessarily always as straightforward as you think, because this actually came up a lot on my Patreon Discord, where patrons will ask about testing on spoons. Either there's like bubbles on their spoons or spots, or the paint can even flake off. Spoons often have a lot of some kind of oily substance on it. I don't know if it's also called mold release. I have painted a lot of spoons. If I paint on the bare plastic without doing any kind of prep work, what often happens is overnight, if you bend the spoon, you can see already the paint is coming off. So the spoons are very bendy and it doesn't retain the paint as well if I don't do any prep work. And I even really just like touch the spoon slightly, the paint can crack and peel off. But because I have done prep work, you will see that mostly it is smooth, except where I didn't sand totally down to the edge, because I don't need to, right? I just need to basically see how the color looks like. There will be this type of bubbling, which is that oily substance. So what this means is that I do sand and prime my spoons before painting. I label all the spoons. These are all the paints I'm gonna test. I just tapped my spoon because I've got my like an external monitor. Oh my god, how ridiculous is that? I just give it a really rough sand with a 600 sponge. It's a pretty old 600. Doesn't really matter that much what you use. I'm not trying to get a smooth surface here. I'm really just trying to get off the surface level, which has that oily substance, and you will be able to see that it's all gone when the spoon is totally matte. And I can see that this part here is still glossy, which is why you will very likely get some bubbling here. I mean, I would never ever do this, but I'm just showing you like what you would do if that really bothers you. And the reason why people practice on spoons is it gives you a really nice, smooth, circular, wide surface to really see the color well on. You can also test on junk parts. You will be able to see the difference between a sanded spoon and an unsanded spoon, which is very glossy. I've sanded all my labeled spoons and a bunch of blank ones as well. I do prime all of my spoons twice to make sure the paint doesn't flake off. It really depends on the spoon and paint. Some spoons are less oily, some paints adhere better, but if you like to keep your spoons for future reference, it's safer to prime.
Get a bunch of extra blanks.
The colors also get 2 to 3 layers, depending on how thin the paint is. I just use as many layers as it takes to bring out the true color. I want to just quickly talk about how I kind of think about colors and mix and stuff like that. These are the 3 main colors. I don't need to replicate these exactly, even though I am going for original colors, because while I really, really love this kind of bluish purple, I'm not super in love with this color. It feels a little dull and lackluster and boring. I'm open to some kind of variation of this color, but I did really want to recreate this one. I might like to use a darker inner frame. That would also give the kit overall a kind of darker color, and I'm not too sure it would go super well with the purple, so I was also open-minded about the inner frame. So that was kind of my thought process going into looking at these colors. I also didn't want to buy any new colors. So these are all colors that I already have that are not thinned yet. Some of the colors I just thinned it, especially this one, just because I wanted to see how it looked like, or maybe I might use it to mix in something, even a few drops. After seeing the colors on the spoons, I thought that this Gaia purple could be a really good main color. It kind of had more of that retro look than this one, which is the Odenkan purple, which I thought also would be like a really good color if I was doing more of like a new agey look, but this one definitely has more of a kind of older anime retro vibe. So I was gonna go with this one just out of the bottle. And then I had to think about this color. This looks to me kind of like a purplish, bluish, grayish color. And mind you, I'm not a professional artist. I kind of just take my best educated guess when I mix colors. I think that as like a very stereotypical female, I was very into colors like makeup. I used to mix and dye my own hair. I did nail art, and we think about colors when we dress or clothing and stuff. So I don't know, it's all just kind of like a mishmash of all of that I feel like has kind of developed my eye for color. I really just eyeball things. When I looked at this color, this could be a good representation of this color with a little bit of a bluish gray, like a lighter bluish gray mixed into it. By the way, I've never used the Nazca line and I was really excited to try them out. These colors look so freaking beautiful and I really wanted to see if I could make use of them in some way. To me, it looked like this plus this could mix well into being this color, and this was the result, which I thought was a pretty good representation of this color. I'm not looking for exact, but actually I ended up really loving this color. This is the kind of purple that I like. And I thought definitely I'd like to use that as a secondary purple, 1-to-1 ratio of these two colors. Then I put it up next to the other purple that I was gonna use. I just felt like they didn't really look that good together. This kind of retro, dull-ish looking color didn't really seem to go so well with this kind of softer, more vibrant, subtle purple. I'm sure if you're a professional artist, you could explain better than me. So I thought that maybe I would mix these two and see how it looks, because I felt like I needed something a little deeper and more vibrant to match this. I mixed these two colors and I got this. I think that it definitely is a little bit more like deeper and more vibrant. This was also a 1-to-1 ratio, and it just happened to work out. I don't always do a 1-to-1 ratio, mind you, but this is a good starting point if you think that a medium between two colors that you're thinking about could be a good fit. So then I put this spoon up to my secondary purple, and I thought they looked a lot better together. And now I had to decide my inner frame. I was wondering if I couldn't use the joint gray for this color, which is just such a beautiful color. It's also got a bit of purple in it. When I was thinning the paint, the colors were kind of separated. The first part of it was a gray color and the second part of it had a lot of purple tint. When I put the three colors together, I thought that there was too much purple in this to be the inner frame color. So I pulled out two of my neutral grays, which are these two colors. If we go with the darker one, it already brightened up the kit a lot instead of using this as an inner frame color. There's really kind of a lack of contrast, whereas if you have this neutral gray, it actually makes the purples stand out a lot more. And a lot of the times, this kind of contrast between colors can really make each individual color kind of stand out more. But I felt like it looked a little bit dark. I tried to use the lighter color. This looked a little bit too bright as well. Inner frames should have a little bit more weight to it, and the lighter the color, the less weight the inner frame has. So I decided to mix these two colors, and that gave me this color, which you really won't be able to see a huge difference probably on camera, but I can. And that difference is important to me. And now that I've decided my main colors, I'm gonna start mixing my accent and detail colors. Before I continue, please remember this is a build vlog, not a technical tutorial. I'm just sharing with you my real process, not telling you what to do or saying my way is the right way. It's actually not. I use a very not by the book way to mix my paints because I find it more efficient and gives me the results I need. All the spoons you saw me test paint, I did by dropping the paint directly into my airbrush cup and back flushing to mix the paint. Usually that's around 10 drops of paint in total. If I'm mixing 2 colors, 1:1 ratio, I'll pour 5 drops of paint from each color. I count the drops and record the ratio on my spoons. I don't measure anything. I can tell you the one downside to my method, which is I may not be able to recreate or adjust my colors exactly. You may also think there is another downside, which is back flushing to mix my paints can clog my airbrush, but it never does because I clean my airbrush between every spoon I paint. I have to. There's not enough buildup for clogging. You may also think my paints won't mix evenly in the airbrush, which is true to a very small extent. However, because I paint at least 2 layers on the spoon, whatever color is in that cup gets on the spoon. I mean, if I didn't tell you, did the spoons you just saw look uneven? And even if they do, who cares? They're just test spoons. Their purpose is for me to see the color out of the bottle. I'm out of time here, so I'll continue this discussion near the end of the video. Here were the yellows that I tested, and the yellow was very important to me because I don't like the color yellow. So if it looks ugly, it really bothers me. Usually I don't like to use a true yellow. Again, I don't like the color yellow, so I very often mix like orange in there. But for this kit, an orangey color wouldn't really go very well with the purple. Verging more on yellow would look better, and I know purple and yellow are opposite colors. So what I finally ended up with was this color, Finisher's Foundation, topped with Nazca Mandarin Orange. Then mixed 5 parts Odenkan Deep Yellow and 2 parts Primary Yellow, and I thought this really brought the yellow back into what is kind of like a darkish orangey yellow because I had used this, and I used this Mandarin Orange just to function as an underlying color to really make the yellow pop. And I know there's yellow surfacer, but I don't really feel like buying a bottle of yellow surfacer. Very often when I try to make the yellow pop, I just use whatever paint color I have underneath. Oh, that was the yellow. The red was a lot less complicated. I ended up choosing these 2 reds from what I have, and I felt like this red was a little bit too bright and vibrant. This one is a really kind of retro-y color, but a little too orange. So I mixed the 2 evenly, 1:1 ratio, and I got this color, which really has that kind of retro red vibe and really gives the kit that kind of like older look. And if you want to see what I mean, I've got some other reds like these, but these would look really good as like a Sazabi red, but not really as much to pair with a purple. And it doesn't really have that kind of retro-y vibe. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like this red really has that kind of old anime look. And so these are my final colors, and that's how I kind of go through the process of finding a custom color. I don't do this for every kit. Like for example, my RGRX78, I went really simple and the paints were mostly out of bottle because that was like a really casual build. But for this kit, I did want to spend a little bit more time on the color, and I felt like the colors themselves are really important because the kit itself is so simple and there's not a lot of detail. Like for the RGRX78, honestly, whatever color you paint it with, it's gonna look good because it's such like a detailed, intricate kit. But for this one, because there's not that much detail, I felt like the color themselves were gonna play a really important role in like the overall look of the kit. So there are kind of all these different things, I guess, that I kind of unconsciously think about, honestly. I think that I just realized that as I'm talking to the camera, which is really interesting because I know that being able to teach something is like the highest level of learning, and I'm really learning a lot myself by kind of like explaining and filming these videos as well. So really happy with these colors, and we're gonna start painting. As I clip and paint my inner frame, let me get back to how I mix paints. I know what the standard way is. You should pour the paint into a little tray, jar, or bottle, use a dropper or weight to measure your ratio, mix with a little tool, and pour that paint into the airbrush cup, and then clean or change out your container and tools. I've made a very conscious decision that I don't want to do that. The reason is because I want to find the fastest and most efficient way to mix, test, and choose my paints. I don't want any extra trays, droppers, or mixing tools to clean. Cleaning my airbrush between every spoon is enough for me. I also don't think test spoons are that important. As for the possibility of not being able to recreate my colors, I usually just make sure I always have more than enough. If you think that's a waste of paint, it's not. Who knows, I may always be able to use that color or mix it into something else. I have been painting Gunpla for a very long time. There are some things that are very important to me, like a very clean finish, color separation, or changing out parts for something that looks better. To achieve those results, I find places to save my time and energy so that I can focus on what's important to me. I think that when you first start off, it's really great to follow the rules and do things by the book and find what does and doesn't work for you. To be honest, I don't usually share this part of my build process because I'm afraid talking about mixing and choosing colors might be a bit boring, and also because I don't have a very standard or even technical method for it. However, my goal for this kit is to just share my real process in a vlog style rather than always making tutorials, which can get a bit exhausting. I also wanted to produce videos more frequently, which means they might be a bit more casual. Otherwise, I only end up uploading one video a month when I try to make very polished and technical tutorials. So please consider this video as me just really sharing what goes on in my head, because I've actually been asked a lot in the past how I choose colors. In the next video, I'll be getting ready to paint up the inner frame of this kit, sharing how I get really smooth airbrush results and easy color separation with some enamel hand painting. Let me show you how I get the smooth out-of-factory look for your painted Gunpla, going beyond basic airbrushing techniques and sharing how I layer surfacer, colors, and top coat. Before any video like this, I make a disclaimer that this is the way I personally paint. It is, of course, not the only way or the right way. I'm just sharing tips and tricks I've picked up over the years, so if you enjoy my work and would like to get similar results, I share with you what I do to get the out-of-factory look with smooth and even surfaces on my painted Gunpla. No holding back. Here we go. I'm currently painting up the HG Psycho Gundam Mk-II, so I will use it to demonstrate my points. This video is more for those who have basic airbrush painting skills but are struggling to produce clean surfaces. If you are not there yet, I recommend you watch my Airbrush Basics tutorial where I cover very thoroughly how to get smooth and even surfaces. As a review, I explain controlling the airbrush trigger, air pressure, timing, and distance while considering the size, structure, and shape of the parts. I almost always paint with 25 psi using lacquer paints unless otherwise specified. I also thin most of my paints with retarder thinner with the maximum thinner to paint ratio. If you've watched my video, got the basics down, but still end up with uneven or rough surfaces or an orange peel-like finish, I've got some extra tips for you that go beyond just the control of an airbrush. Uneven and rough surfaces can be caused by a lot of different factors: incorrect painting technique, too low or high PSI, a clogged or spitting airbrush, or simply a dusty work environment. I will share all the extra steps I take to prevent these issues. Preparing for a smoothly painted surface starts before painting. I always clip my parts starting from big, they're easier to find, to small pieces. When I paint, I start from the smallest to the biggest parts. It's already organized for me. This is for efficiency. Smaller parts need less air pressure, and painting similar sizes means I don't have to keep changing the air pressure back and forth, but also to prevent possible overspray. When you go from painting a huge part to a tiny part, your hands are used to using a high pressure with the trigger pulled back more, which can cause overspray on a small part. Progressing from small to large helps you prevent this issue. Now, let's do some painting. First of all, I always do a test spray with thinner before I start painting to make sure my airbrush is not clogged and I have a good flow. You don't want to find out it's clogged after you've filled the paint cup with paint and have to pour it out to clean your airbrush. Next, I never pour a full cup of paint into my paint cup. First of all, I hate using the lid and having to clean it, so paint can splash around and spill over, especially because I sometimes knock my airbrush into something when I place it back into my airbrush holder. Most importantly though, I always only pour a half cup of paint because paint does dry up as you go. The thinner evaporates, but also the paint settles at the bottom of the cup, and the paint often comes out thicker when you get to the leftover. I'll come back to this point. Before I start painting, I always spray the part first to clear it of dust. Do make sure the trigger is pushed down and not even a tiny bit back so you don't get small specks of paint spitting out. I make sure my part is completely clean before I start painting. Let's look at how I paint surfacer. Cookie gave a really good analogy for a surfacer to me before. He said it's like pouring concrete before building a house. Paint cannot stick to smooth plastic, and surfacer provides the foundation for paint to adhere to. This means that the first layer of paint, your surfacer, onto bare plastic is more fickle and is most prone to looking rough. So, what's the best way to lay it on? I start with a very light, misty coat of surfacer. This introduces a rough, tacky surface on the bare plastic for the next layer of paint to adhere better to. The layer is not wet and the coverage is not even. It's just a mist. Then I paint a lightly wet coat without aiming for full coverage. I also use this second layer to ensure I cover any nooks and crannies. Then I do a third fully wet coat, aiming for full coverage of the part, but making sure to not overdo it and cause any pooling. Surfacer is really the most important step for getting a smooth paint surface because it is the foundation for all preceding layers of paint. I've heard a patron on my Discord server say their surfacer came out rough and they just let it be because they thought the paint will cover up the roughness, which it did not. Your surfacer has to be smooth for your paint to look smooth. If you notice it's not for one of your parts, immediately figure out what the issue is on junk parts or spoons, adjust settings, whatever might be the issue before moving on. Remember how I always only use half a cup of paint? Between every half cup, I swish the thinner around in the cup, clearing the edges of residue paint, and run some thinner through the cup. I can paint for about 1 to 2 hours without any clogging and paint spitting onto parts. Try painting with a full cup of paint and never running any thinner through the cup. You'll likely clog your airbrush a lot sooner. The new paint I pour in also lays on a lot smoother. I have some parts from here which got just the tiniest bit of dust or lint on it, and I've kept them slanted here of the painted parts so that I know which parts are the one. And I don't try to get rid of the dust on all of the parts. If there are little parts or parts that are not important, then I leave it. But for parts that are very flat, big, and are gonna show up very well like this, I do try to get rid of it. Okay, so the little piece of dust is here. And I know it's might not seem like a big deal, but a little piece of dust like this every time you paint a layer of paint. So after if I paint it purple, I get a little piece here, and I do top coat, I get a little piece here. Then the part does start to become not really as smooth and clean as I personally like. Of course, you don't have to do this. So I can't remember if this went on before or after I finished painting all of the surfacer, but usually I stop if I see a lint. But sometimes if I don't feel like stopping, I just paint over most of the part and then hope that I can get it off. I'm going to try to take this off without removing the surfacer so I don't have to paint it again. But if I do have to paint it again, it's not a huge deal because I'm still not finished painting surfacer. Okay, it is gone. And I did it in a little circular motion, which is not the best. In one direction is the best, but it felt like it wasn't coming off. It did leave a mark in the surfacer, but that's fine because I'm going to be painting this a purple anyways, and that purple is going to cover this mark without problems. So now nice and clean, and I've got a few more of these pieces to clean up. You can see for this part, I had started painting like the second layer of paint and it's still unfinished, but a piece of lint or dust flew onto the part, so I just stopped painting so that it's a little easier to get rid of. It's really superficial because I stopped painting right away, so it'll come off pretty easily. Yep, that one came off pretty easily. You can see that my booth filter is pretty dirty, which to be honest, I don't really care that much if it's really dirty. I don't really super notice if the suction is weaker or not. The suction on this booth is not great in the first place anyways. The issue I have is that I'm getting a lot of like residue falling off, like dust, because of this buildup, and I feel like that is getting onto my parts, so I am going to change out the filter. I've painted only one kit really with this booth, which was the RGRX 78, and that's not even that intensive, so I think these filters really only last like about one kit. But I did get two filters that came with this kit. This is the only new one I have left. I'm gonna order some other ones. I'm going to replace this. I'm gonna turn on the fan. There's a lot of dust. I wear my mask. So nice and clean. Hi, it's your bedtime.
Why not book?
We already read the book. It's your bedtime now. Good night.
Okay.
Alright, so I'm going to be painting up the secondary purple. You'll notice that I do clip by runners, but also I start from the small parts and move on to the bigger parts like I've mentioned. Now, let's get on to painting colors. Notice that I always paint the outer under edges of my parts because you never know when there's a little crack after assembly or an underside might show. However, I try to avoid painting the pegs, which definitely won't show. You don't want super thick pegs during assembly. I do fully paint pegs of joints, though, because parts of those often peek through. While I focus a lot on layering and a smooth surface for surfacer, I shift my focus to even coverage with my colors. I no longer find it necessary to use a misty coat because paint lays on surfacer more easily. Here I can skip the misty coat and go straight to a lightly wet coat. Again, not aiming for full coverage because we still don't want to overdo it. I again use this first layer of paint to cover any nooks and crannies. I also linger a little longer on corners and edges of parts, which are easy to miss and paint doesn't hit as well. For the second coat, I spray a good wet layer of paint, aiming for full coverage. I'd stop here for small parts, especially inner frame pieces that you don't want to get too thick and probably won't show. For bigger pieces, I may do a third wet coat if my coverage is lacking, and finally a light misty coat overall to ensure even color coverage. So I have painted up the inner frame now, and I'm going to get on to some panel lining and enamel hand painting. Since this is part of my HG Psycho Gundam Mk-II build, Let's have a little interlude as I share the results of my panel lining and enamel hand painting. I don't show the process as I plan to focus on it in the next video, where I plan to talk about how to get color separation and painted details without masking. Consider this a little preview. Additionally, if you are interested in seeing any of the airbrushing done in this video in real time, I have a nearly 30-minute, fully narrated and annotated Patreon exclusive unedited video at patreon.com/FrostedSnow. I also have an archive of uncut footage of painting from many of my past Gunpla if you'd like to see more to really hone in on my painting techniques. Our small, tight-knit community of Gunpla painters on my Patreon Discord and I are always there to help you troubleshoot through any problems you may face while painting. Alright, so here are all of the parts panel lined and enamel hand painted. It might not be immediately obvious, but here are some parts. I'm really happy with some of the finger parts that I was able to panel line them. And it went on really smoothly without issues. Usually parts like this, it will not flow very well. And that black looks really good against this gray. Same for parts like this, a little harder to see on camera, but these have been panel line accented inside of the fingers. Also this part of the hand with some panel line accent and some enamel hand painting here for the darker gray. I also panel lined and enamel hand painted the damaged head. The inner frame is going to show through. Also, only one of the eyes are going to show through for the damaged head, but I did both of them just kind of for practice. Added panel line accent to the vents. That's a really good spot to do. It really defines it a lot more. Now, let's get on to top coating. When I first started painting, I always found top coating a bit intimidating because it's clear. How am I supposed to know how it's layering down on the part? Where did it hit? Is it going on evenly? Is there too much or too little? I'm going to give you an almost spiritual answer here. See the light and listen to the sounds. When you paint anything, surfacer, paint, or top coat, you should always be trying to paint while catching the glare of the light that shines from the wet paint. However, this is especially the case when you paint a color very similar to the underlying color. For example, the inner frame gray on top of my light gray surfacer and top coat, because you cannot easily see how the color is laying on, in which case you should rely on the reflection of the paint, the light coming off it, to see your progress. Additionally, at some point, you should develop a feel for when paint is hitting too soft or too hard, your air pressure is too low or high, your airbrush is too close or far away, by listening to the sound of the paint hitting on the part and the sound of the air pressure coming out of your airbrush. It's hard for me to tell you an exact volume or something like that, but listen to how it should sound when your paint lays on just right and your surface is smooth. That means you've got the perfect combination. Use the light and sound to help you see as you paint. Before I finish up, I'm going to answer one more most commonly asked question in nearly all my painting videos. How much time do I give between each layer of paint? To be honest, it's great if you can give as much time as possible between every layer. I try to do that more for candy painting. However, you'll notice I don't give any time at all for each type of paint. I used to paint the misty coat first on all my parts, then go back and do the second layer for all the parts, and then the third layer. However, pulling every part in and out so many times just took too long, so I do it all in one go now. There is a lot of time between surfacer, paints, and top coats though, because of my own time constraints. However, if I had 8 hours a day to paint, I'd have no problems going through all the steps, surfacer, paint, and top coat, in one day. Because by the time I start painting the first piece and finish the last piece of a batch, The first piece would have had at least an hour or two to dry. It usually takes me about 1 to 2 hours to paint up the parts on one piece of foam, depending on the size, including any cleanup work I do. However, I always leave my parts overnight before certain steps like top coating on enamel paints or doing final assembly after top coat. So here are all the parts painted up of the secondary purple. I started working on the clear stand as well. In the next video, I will paint up the main purple outer armor here and panel lining and enamel hand painting both of the purple parts to get some easy color separation. Hello everyone, let me give you 10 tips on easy and clean enamel hand painting for some quick color separation on your plastic models while I paint up my HG Psycho Gundam Mk-II. Previously, I've already added panel line accent and enamel hand painted the inner frame. In this video, I will focus on the secondary purple parts because it includes the hardest piece in this kit to enamel hand paint. Do remember that if you want very clean and smooth results, masking and airbrushing is the way to go. It takes more time, is harder to clean up errors, but gives the cleaner results. On the other hand, enamel hand painting is usually the faster and easier way to get some color separation on the details of your kits, but not the perfect way. Because it is hand painted, it may not look as smooth. However, I believe that with proper execution and some patience, hand-painted enamel details can look just as good while saving you a lot of time. If you haven't yet, I highly recommend watching my very thorough enamel hand painting tutorial where I talk about the differences between the strength of acrylic, enamel, and lacquer paints, how to choose the best parts to hand paint, and more. In this video, you will see me apply the knowledge from there and offer more detailed tips while painting my current project, the HG Psycho Gundam Mk-II. Okay, so these are the secondary purple parts I'm going to enamel hand paint. The way I pull them out and check if they need to be painted or not, or if they will show through, is I look through the manual or sample pictures for them. And if you want to learn more about how I find parts without runner numbers, I have a whole video for that. There are some parts in the outer armor, parts like this, that are very obviously able to have some color or detail separation, but there are also some parts which I am not able to always tell if they're going to show or not. I'm the most apprehensive about this part. I'm planning to paint the tube, and if possible, maybe this part, this like outer part of the tube. I'm going to see how that goes. I will very likely have to paint one part, maybe the tube first, top coat it, and then paint the other parts. These are all of the basic colors that I have. I did order almost all of these from Argama Hobby, my sponsor. They have a lot of enamel paints. Except for these tester ones, they're discontinued now, I think, although I think they were really the best enamel paints for metallics. Otherwise, the Tamiya ones, really, they do fine. For this build, because I want to keep the retro anime look, I'm gonna not use any metallics. That might not seem like a big deal, but that's actually one of my kind of overarching goals for this kit, is because I fall back onto metallics really easy, whether for the inner frame or for painting up details, just because it's so easy to make a kit look good with some metallic details. So for this kit, I'm not allowed to use any metallics. These are the 4 grays that I have. Of course, if you want, you can always mix with a little black or white, but mixing is a lot of work and you will need to use the same color throughout the kit. So I really do recommend just like buying a set of colors that you think you're going to use. A variety of gray is a great set of colors to have because you use grays as detail colors for almost anything, and I used quite a few of these grays for my RX 78-2 that I recently painted. When I choose colors for a part, say like this, to consider a few things is how much do I want this detail to pop. I'm gonna be painting this little dot here, and notice I've already done the panel line accent first, and that's what you should do first because it's going to be in the recesses, and then you do your enamel hand painting. How I choose colors for parts is, number one, I have to consider how much do I want that detail to pop. If I really want a certain detail to pop, I might choose a brighter color, especially if the detail is small. It'll just be a little small pop. If I want a more subtle difference on a part like this, which I've already checked is going to be the inner part of the arm, I don't need a detail like this to pop too much. In fact, I don't want it to because it's not like a significant part of the outer design. I don't really want to draw my eyes here. So I'm gonna do this as a very subtle color separation, but I do still want the color separation just because I like having a lot of visual interest in the kit. I'm probably gonna use a darker gray, one that's not gonna show up too much. But for a small little detail like this, which I've already checked, it's gonna be this little cylinder circle part here. I don't mind having a little bit more of a pop here. I'm probably gonna be using a lighter gray for that. Nothing too crazy, maybe like this light gray. I'm gonna look at the colors and then decide. But that's kind of my mindset going into it. Whenever possible, I try to use toothpicks. A common concern with any form of hand painting is leaving unsightly brushstrokes. So, using a toothpick will help you avoid that because it's not a brush, so no brush strokes. It's also a lot easier to use and dispose of without cleaning. However, it is only best for easy details, that is, mostly flat surfaces with a high border or deep panel lines around them. Notice I always move the part, but not my painting or working hand. The painting hand always stays in the optimal position. I twist the paint off the toothpick to reuse. Super easy, no cleaning. Notice that throughout this video, I always use the paint straight from the bottle. There's no need to thin it because it already comes in the best consistency to paint with. Sometimes if my paint is a bit old, I do add some thinner into the whole bottle and shake it up a bit. Whether you paint with a toothpick or brush, remember to always dab and drag, but never to stroke. That is, you pull and maneuver the paint around, rather than layer and smear it on. This is, again, to avoid brush strokes, and you will see me demonstrate it with a brush soon. While avoiding brush strokes is a common concern, another issue you may not think about until you've made the error is maintaining consistent paint thickness. Do you notice I leave a little gap whenever I go in with fresh paint and drag it to connect with the older paint? I do it with these narrow gap details in particular because when the tip of a toothpick with the fresh paint touches a part, it deposits most of the paint right away. Toothpicks are harder to control. I do this to make sure the paint is even across the whole surface and not too thick. I don't necessarily do this with a brush and a wider surface. As I hand paint, I notice I missed a potential area to add some panel line accent to. It happens to flow well. Sometimes it doesn't, and I just erase it after. Even if you don't airbrush, enamel hand painting easy details like these really upgrades the look of your kit. Do remember though, enamel hand paints have a longer curing time, so it will have more time to self-level and give you an even looking surface. That's why this works and can be preferable to acrylic paints, which have a faster drying time and can leave brush strokes more easily and also cannot be erased. I do talk about all of this in my enamel hand painting video. Before we continue, let's do a quick unboxing from my sponsor, Argama Hobby, where I get my kids' tools and paints. I didn't get a lot this time, but there is something from here that I need. And it's super well packaged, and you can probably tell what this is. Oh, okay. G rework. I always thought it was gray work. Arthur, the owner of Argama Hobby, says he thinks these ones are a bit better than Delpy Decal. I haven't actually used G rework yet, but I am at the stage of having to use decals now to finish up my kit. And so that was my mini haul from Argama Hobby, and thank you always so much for your support. Now, let's get on to the hardest parts to paint today, and using a brush. I start off by dropping some enamel thinner into a tray, ready on standby for cleaning. a bit at a time is enough because it can get dirty. I always start off by cleaning my brush a bit, never pushing it face down, which can ruin the bristles, but always at an angle to keep the tip straight. I think one of the key to precise and clean hand painting is to have a long-lasting, fine, pointy-tipped brush. You don't want splayed and stray bristles after a few uses, which I've experienced with cheap hobby store brushes, so it's worth investing in a good quality brush. If you are interested in any of the brushes or products I use in my videos, you can find direct links on my Amazon storefront. Any purchases you make after browsing my storefront supports me with a small commission at no extra cost to you, helping me to continue creating content like these. I've also recently opened up a Canadian storefront at the request of some of my fellow Canadians. On both storefronts, I have an entire section called My Enamel Paints and Tools, where you'll find a lot of the products I use in this video. Now, let's get back to hand brushing. As previously mentioned, I am using a dabbing motion, even with a brush. When painting a larger surface with a brush, I do still connect the new paint to the old paint. Even though I don't leave an obvious gap, I do still start the paint a tiny bit away from the old paint and then connect. This is to ensure even coverage. If I feel like there is a lot of paint left on my brush or in the paint already laid down, I may spread that out a bit, like I'm doing here. What you do all depends on how much paint you picked up or is left on your brush. Remember, the goals are always even paint thickness and coverage without brush strokes, while staying in line as much as possible. Okay, so I originally was going to use this gray here on the tube, but I thought it didn't really stand out enough. So I thought that maybe I could just use a darker color for this outer part of the tube and see how it matched this, but I didn't really like it. And then I tried the lighter gray, and I think that would be a little better, so I think I'm going to use these two colors. I'm going to be erasing this one. I'm okay with this part of the tube really standing out on the outer armor because, I don't know, I think it's like a really nice detail, so that's why I went with a lighter gray. Don't worry, I'm going to show you how I finished painting the tube. However, if at any point you want to completely erase what you did, don't worry, it's really easy, and that's the beauty of painting with enamel paints, a weaker and erasable paint over lacquer, a stronger paint which will not melt under enamel. Just get a Q-tip, dab it in some enamel thinner, any brand works, and erase away. Do try to avoid getting too much thinner onto the part. The Q-tip shouldn't be dripping with thinner, and make sure your lacquer paint is completely cured before enamel hand painting. I leave it overnight. Sometimes enamel thinner can erase a bit of lacquer paint. This usually doesn't happen for me, but I get a lot of my patrons on Discord mentioning it does for them. I do notice it can happen for me sometimes too. I can't say exactly why in every situation, but I'll notice a bit of purple on my Q-tip. I noticed it happened on a part of my shield where I sprayed the gloss paint a bit matte because I was touching it up, doing a few light misty coats as a final finish. I assume it's because matte paint has more surface irregularities, or you can think of it as larger particles, which is what scatters light, making it easier to wipe off. However, I noticed this is less the case with a gloss finish, which has a smoother and tighter bond, making it more resistant. That's why it is generally best if you plan to enamel hand paint to use gloss paints and avoid too many misty coats that will turn your glossy surface matte. I know it looks like I went through a lot of work erasing this, but I think it is worth it for the color change. Sometimes you just have to see it in place to know if you like it or not. Notice I'm using an old brush to get the thinner into nooks and crannies that are harder to reach with a Q-tip. Now, nice and clean. Remember to let the thinner dry before painting it again. Now, let's get on to repainting in the lighter gray. You'll see that it was hard for me to film painting the edge, but it's all about having a steady hand and making sure you don't have too much fresh paint on your brush. I usually deposit all the paint on the main part and then go to the edge. At the end, I will completely clean my brush and dab tiny bits of paint to touch up. Now we get to spot cleaning. While you can do big cleanup jobs with a Q-tip, smaller cleanup with a finish master, there are times when cleanup is just a tiny spot in a hard-to-reach place. Using an old brush with some thinner works great in this case. Before cleanup, make sure you wipe off any excess thinner. You don't want too much seeping everywhere, and clean the brush often in between. It is a bit tedious, but really gives your hand-painted details a very clean look. Everything else can be top coated after decal as is, but this one I'm going to top coat first and then finish the rest of the painting. Okay, so these are the parts after top coat. I usually top coat when two different enamel colors are right next to each other. In this kit, there were only 3 sets of part like this, so it's not a lot of them. I try to avoid having to do this as much as possible because enamel hand painting is supposed to be easy and I don't like all the wait time in between. Before top coating enamel, a weaker paint, with lacquer on top, a stronger paint, you should definitely wait for the enamel to fully cure. Again, overnight is best. When painting a stronger paint over a weaker paint, I always do a light misty coat first to provide a protection layer that won't melt the paint underneath. After that, I go right to the second wet coat of lacquer. Do note that if you choose to use a matte top coat, you shouldn't be painting metallic enamels over that. Or if you do, you won't be able to do cleanup without the paint leaving a metallic pigment, kind of sparkles and glitters on the surface. It's close to impossible to erase that off a matte surface. This is something I learned from experience. So remember in my enamel hand painting video, I said it's important to be able to judge a part and whether it'll be easy to paint or not. To be honest, this part is not going to really show very well. It's kind of like the armpit area and the arm is going to be here. But it is going to show just a tiny bit, and I have a really hard time leaving details like this that are obviously supposed to be a different color in the original color. So I decided to just paint this. I've already done the panel line accent. I know that going into this is going to be really hard to paint because it doesn't have, like I mentioned in my enamel hand painting video, it doesn't have a defined panel line around this circle. If you were working on a resin kit, you would scribe the panel line around this so you get like a really defined detail, and also you can use that panel line to help you mask if you wanted to. But of course I'm not going to do that for this kit. So I decided to try it out anyways, and a lot of the times I'm not 100% sure I can actually execute what I want. If I give it a try and I find that it looks really bad, I can always erase it. So I gave it a try this first time and it was a little messy, but it's okay because I was willing to do the cleanup work, which cleaned it up a lot more. So I'm gonna do that for this one. This is actually quite a difficult little detail to paint, but I just really wanted to do that. I use really the same process here, so before we finish off, let me answer the most commonly asked question I get regarding my process for panel lining, enamel hand painting, and decals, which is, do you use a gloss top coat before any of this? People are worried about panel line accent not flowing, enamel thinner melting the lacquer paint, and decals not moving well without a gloss top coat. My personal overall answer is no. I do not gloss top coat at any point for the purposes mentioned previously. I already demonstrated why it is not necessary for enamel hand painting. Very clearly, you have seen my paint did not melt, and explained that as long as you use a gloss color paint and paint it gloss, the enamel thinner will not erase your lacquer paint. This rule applies universally for helping panel line accent flow and decals to move. As long as your gloss paint is painted with wet coats and therefore has a glossy finish, you shouldn't experience any problems. Additionally, Bandai panel lines are not very deep, so if you top coat over that, filling in the panel lines, they will actually become more shallow and possibly increase the chance of poor flow. I do experience this after painting if I didn't rescribe Bandai panel lines, which I usually don't for casual builds. Now, that is my personal overall answer. Sometimes there are cases where you may be using very thick decals with a very prominent clear border you'd like to hide, or you are stuck using a matte color paint but want to enamel hand paint some metallic details on top. Then you may choose to do a gloss top coat. Obviously, every situation calls for something different. Wow, that was a lot. We are nearing the end of this build, and my next video should be the final one in this series as I finish painting up the rest of the kit, do the final assembly, and share the finished product with you. Hello everyone, come along with me as I finish painting up and doing the final assembly for my HG Psycho Gundam Mk-II. Gonna get ready to paint up the yellow parts and these clear parts just with a clear top coat. Here we go. I start off with the Finisher's Foundation White, which also serves as a primer. I'm not bothered about fully covering the yellow underneath because I plan to paint it yellow anyways. I don't use a gray surfacer though because it really darkens and dulls the yellow. Midway progress. I move on to an orange base here. If you watched my color testing and selection video, you'll know I often choose to add some orange to my yellows because I'm not a big fan of yellow. I talk more about it there. I also don't use a yellow surfacer just because I didn't want to buy a bottle and I try to use what I already have. I move on to this custom mix Odenkan yellow. I have used Odenkan metallics before and really loved them. However, I experienced some issues with the Odenkan basic colors. I'll come back to this topic. As I paint, whenever I notice any decently visible imperfection on my part, dust, specks, splatter, I always sand it off if it's a larger and obviously going to be visible part. I don't do this with inner frame or smaller or more hidden parts on the kit though. I filmed it just once here, but I do this throughout the whole painting process. I use a soft sponge, a 1000 here, and sand off any imperfection. It's very superficial because I stop painting right away and the imperfection will come off easily. It would be best to wait for the part to be fully dry if you don't want to do any repainting, but because I catch it in the painting process, I may or may not wait at all, depending on how deep the imperfection looks, and sand it off. Any scratch marks will be covered by the paint to follow. It is a lot of work, but I like really clean surfaces. I always keep a set of cleanup tools, sponges and tweezers, next to my booth for easy reach, or else it's easy to get lazy and let a few imperfections go, which can add up over time. I move on to the red parts, which were a breeze using my good old Gaia Notes paints. I've skipped through most of the painting to keep this video a reasonable length, but if you'd like to see more of me painting in real time, I have an uncut version where I talk more about the details of building and painting this kit. You can access this and previous extended videos on my Patreon. Your support really helps me to continue filming, editing, and producing these videos for the channel. Okay, so here are the reds that I just finished painting. And I was gonna do mostly enamel hand painting, but I just wanna walk you through a little bit of the process of how I choose whether to mask or enamel hand paint. Generally, for a casual build like this, I would choose to not mask at all if possible. But there are parts like this, which would actually be easier to mask than to enamel hand paint. So for a part that sticks out like this, it is enamel hand paintable, but the edges like this are a little bit harder to paint really clean, which I would still do it if I had to, but because this part sticks out, it's really easy to mask. Here are the masked pieces. What's important when spraying a masked part is to keep your PSI low, or if you have an air pressure adjustment valve like I do, lower it to avoid too much air lifting your masking tape. I also try to avoid directing my airbrush against the edge of the tape to avoid overspray. Multiple thin layers rather than one thick coat is best practice. Finally, I always mask and spray parts on the same day before the tape's adhesion has a chance to weaken over time. Normally I should wait for this to completely dry, but it has dried for about, I don't know, 30-40 minutes, which should be okay really for a very small part like this. It's really cute. Just talking a bit about color selection, the reason why I decided to do this dark gray is because there is this little nub here, which I would like to do a light gray. And I think the smaller details, a lighter color, and the bigger details, a slightly darker color will work well here. I now hand brush the light gray detail with enamel paint. I always clean my brush off with some enamel thinner, wipe off the excess before I start painting. I also do this quite often throughout. Having a clean brush with a pointy tip is one of the keys to getting clean hand-painted details. Because this detail is small, I only dip a tiny amount of paint and use a light hand. With only the leftover paint on the brush, I extend the paint to the edges, being extra careful to keep things in line. For more details, I have multiple very thorough videos on enamel hand painting. I am now getting ready to do the decals with the G Rework decals. I'm actually strangely excited to do this. Decals is one of my favorite processes of doing Gunpla. I feel like it really adds a really nice finishing touch, and it's really fun to apply decals. I do kind of wish they came with like physical instructions, but I look on my computer screen for it. Oh nice, they have like a plastic in between here. Yay! This is kind of nice too, to display as a little postcard maybe. Just finished the red parts, still quite a few more parts to go. I did change the decals a bit on the shield. This is how things are looking after top coat. Generally, before I top coat, I always wipe down my entire booth with some wet wipe to eliminate dust. I also found this particularly important in such a small booth with huge parts. There is only so much room for dust to circulate in here. Therefore, I have found that in comparison to the much smaller RGRX 78, which I first painted after buying this booth, I got a lot more dust on my parts. I know that I could get a waterfall booth, and I've even been offered a free one for my channel, but I paint in a very small room with multiple uses, so for now, I need a portable booth I can easily remove after use. Here are the parts after top coat. I think the shield does look very cool. And here are the secondary purple parts top coated. I really love how these turned out. Now, throughout the rest of this video, I'm going to talk about all the difficulties I faced for this build and how I overcame them. I mentioned in my 50 Gunpla painting tips video, but I really wanted to start advocating for Gunpla YouTubers to show more of the challenges, mistakes, or accidents they face. Otherwise, it can be really discouraging for especially beginners watching these perfect snap, snap, done videos. The slogan I used there was "No glamour, only labor." And that's really the truth behind all these fast edits you see. So there's going to be two major issues I'll talk about. One is my Odankan paint, and the other common assembly issues. Let's start with my Odankan paint. First, I mixed my outer armor purple with the Gaia 10th Anniversary Edition purple, and an Odenkan Basic Color Purple, which New Type so generously sent to me as a kind of one-time welcome to Canada gift. They sent that to my friend living in Seattle, who so kindly brought it with her when we met up in Vancouver. What this all means is that I can't easily get a second bottle of these paints. In as much of a nutshell as possible, the Odenkan paints turned out to be very thick but translucent, which is a really weird combination. Paints are usually either very thick and full coverage or thin and translucent. But thick and translucent is like the worst combination. I think this picture says it all. On the right are Gaia paints, bottles are totally clean, and left are the Odenkan paints I mixed for this kit. You see all the chunky residue in the Odenkan bottle. Basically, no matter how much or little paint I poured into my paint cup, when there was about half of it left, the paint started to have a hard time coming through. Goodness, here are all the purple main armor parts. Did a little bit of masking. I did thin the paints beforehand. On the bottle, the only information we are given is that they are pre-thinned for a 0.5 needle, but doesn't tell you the thinning ratio for a 0.3 needle. So I made my most educated guess, but still the paint always got thick halfway through the paint cup. Most likely the chunky stuff settles at the bottom as you paint. This meant that I either had to increase my air pressure to push the paint through, which gave me a bumpier finish, or add a bit of extra thinner into the cup halfway through painting, which could overthin my paint. But that was basically what I had to do, and I wasn't too happy with my outer armor surface being not as clean as I usually like. Next, the paint was also very translucent, so I really only had two options. Either paint with a heavier hand to get the coverage I needed, pull back the trigger more, get closer to the part, or paint it in many multiple thin coats like you would a clear candy paint. At first, I just used a heavy hand because I wanted to get it done fast, but trying to use a heavy hand with translucent paint gave me pooling on smaller parts and overspray on larger parts, and my colors were quite uneven. Finally, about halfway through, I decided to just thin the heck out of the paint, which would solve the thickness problem, and also to paint it like a clear candy paint in many multiple thin coats. That did solve both these issues, but it took a lot more time, which was what I was trying to avoid. I did also know I'd be going over everything with a matte top coat, which would help smooth things out. Then my third issue was I was also running out of the Odenkan purple. Because it's so translucent, I had to mix more of it into my custom purple. To resolve this midway, I had to pull out a few of the dark purple parts and paint it in the secondary purple. Parts that won't look too weird as another color, including the bottom of the feet, which was a huge piece. If I offer a few takeaways from this, especially for those new to painting, it's this. Number one, test paint your final colors on multiple junk parts. While I did test paint my colors on spoons, and I did notice the paint seemed a bit translucent, I wasn't able to see how that would transfer to a large kit like this. I didn't think it would be a big deal. A thick and translucent paint on round, detailless spoons lays on very differently than on a large, flat part with some details. Number two, stick to well-known and long-established brands like Gaia Notes, Mr. Hobby, or my go-to in Korea was IPP. I do usually offer this as advice for beginners because whenever Cookie and I try newer paint brands, we often run across issues here and there. And what I experienced with the Odenkan paint is just one example. It's okay to try new brands if you have some experience because you know how to handle the issues. However, when you are new to painting, you never know if the problems you are experiencing is because of you or the paint. We've got just a few more final touches. I do some more panel lining, enamel hand painting, and decals. One of my patrons recently asked me on Discord how long it took me to do the decals. It took maybe a few days, about 4 to 5 hours a day. A lot of that time though was spent thinking about decal placement. I wanted to keep the retro look of this kit, so I didn't want to use too many decals because this should be balanced with the overall design of the kit, the kind of look you're going for, and the amount of color separation and decals already on that particular part and the surrounding parts. I had to spend more time thinking about this in particular because I felt like the G rework decals were a bit over decaled. There's a lot of decals on there, which is a great bang for your buck, but it was also a bit of option overload. Also, the fact that they did not provide a physical application manual also made it very cumbersome to do.
Ta-da!
Ta-da! Oh, thanks. Oh, thank you. I cannot focus. Oh! Do you hear something?
Yeah?
As you'll notice, I do assemble without runner numbers, without pre-assembly, and I've talked all about how and why in a very thorough video dedicated to this topic. I do really stick by this for casual plastic builds painted in original colors. So I'm not sure if you've noticed, but throughout this final build and paint video, I've focused less on execution techniques, how to airbrush, enamel hand paint, and more on holistic perspectives, why it's important for beginners to stick to major paint brands, considering your goals and kit design with decal placement. It's because I feel like I've talked practical tips and execution to death in every video, but also I'm actually more of a holistic type of teacher. Like what I said about no glamour, only labor. What I want you to take away from my videos is not just all the practical tips and advice. What I want you to see and realize is that there is no snap, snap, done perfection, which is all the magic of YouTube editing. And we will do a bit of that at the end of this video just because it's satisfying to watch. But painting Gunpla is more like labor, call it done, which is partially why I've started filming at least my assembly stage in time-lapse so you can see all the work put into it. But I think we also have to take some of the responsibility upon ourselves as a community because it's also not easy for YouTubers, but let's say specifically Gunpla YouTubers, to be honest with their own mistakes and challenges because there are some very judgmental people online. It's also not easy, let's say for me, to film when I make a major error, although I realize it could be helpful for people as a learning experience. But in those moments, my soul has literally left my body. Especially during final assembly, all I want to do is quickly fix the issue and move on. Also, there is the time constraint. People have a short attention span nowadays and they don't want to know every detail of your build. How many just skip to see the final product? Despite all this, within my abilities, I'm going to finish up this video by at least talking about some of the challenges I had and offer one more holistic piece of advice that I used to anchor myself throughout this whole build in particular, and that is to trust the process. It's very easy for us to focus on every little mistake as we build. The scratches, chipped paint, or the slightly tilted decal. I myself was not so happy with the outer armor purple because I had to use a heavier hand or more layers to get the coverage I needed from the very translucent paint. The whole time I thought the paint came out way too dark, didn't match the other colors I customized for the kit, and was not what I had wanted. I had to keep reminding myself that I'm probably being too particular. The matte top coat will dull the color down a bit, and it's going to look great once the kit is put together. I also had a few of my own tilted decals, which are a lost cause really once they've been pushed down with a cotton bud, so I just had to live with it. I, of course, like everyone, chipped the paint of quite a few parts during final assembly. What I normally do myself for small chips is use a toothpick, dip it in some lacquer paint, and dot it onto the chipped area. This is really a quick fix solution, not for perfect results. Do not use a paintbrush loaded with lacquer paint, because that will melt the paint in the surrounding area. I then airbrushed the retouched area with my matte top coat. This helps to soften the look a bit. I also broke one of the joints for the arm during final assembly, like in the very last stage. So I cut out the inner structure of that part, filled it with some epoxy putty, and aligned some metal rods to fit into the female pegs. I used some super glue to thicken the rods and make them a better fit. The rods were long enough so that the thickness didn't have to be perfect, and it held the part together. There are a variety of ways you could do this, like with UV putty, which I had bought like 6 months ago, but I have forgotten to buy a UV light. Today, I finally ordered one. After the peg broke, I just had to breathe, be patient, and put down my project and go do something else while my putty cured. The mindset that pulled me through all this is that I know once the whole kit is assembled, all the colors, the numerous details that are inherent to the kit, the color separation, panel lining, and decals I made the effort to apply all come together. The eyes will see the kit as a whole rather than zooming in on all the little imperfections that really only I would know about. Sometimes it's best just to let go of small mistakes. Don't try to redo or fix everything, and give yourself a kind but firm hand to push yourself through a build. Just keep going until you reach the end and trust the process. I'd like to express my appreciation for my Patreon supporters who make running this channel possible. Patrons receive special perks like access to my archive of uncut extended versions of all my previous Gunpla painting videos and an invitation to my private Discord server where you can join in on fun group builds and challenges. Happy building, everyone. For 5 months, I ran a shading group challenge for my patrons on Discord. Everyone voted on the skill they would like to work on, and this turned out to be shading. I also filmed an exclusive pre-shading tutorial on my Patreon to help out. Over the course of the challenge, we posted our work in progress on Discord, asked questions, and shared shading tips and tricks with each other. It's really a lot of fun and much more motivating to have a community to share our work with and find help from when we need. The challenge was also meant to push us out of our comfort zones and try a new technique. As you can see, we had some amazing entries, many of which was the first time some of us tried shading with an airbrush. At the end of the challenge, Cookie and I chose the top 3 entries. Congratulations to the winners and everyone who completed their entries. If you'd like to join us for future group builds and challenges, find us at patreon.com/frostysnow.